Da-da-da, da-da, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. Welcome everybody to our second inaugural, no, that's not the right word, the second edition, there we go, of our Partisans Cultural Committee podcast, video, whatever you want to call it. Thanks again to everybody who watched our first episode. Thanks everybody who liked it, subscribe to the channel. Please get in the comments, share with your friends. The whole point of having a fucking commie lefty podcast is for everybody to get together and talk and argue. So yeah, I hope you guys like that episode. I hope you guys like this episode, and let's get into it. We're back looking at, also a little belatedly, the very critically acclaimed and pretty controversial Star Wars Andor. But before we go into that, and before we go into a little more of that dun, 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 and all of that good shit, let's talk a little bit about Star Wars in general. One of the most American movie franchises, but also I think one with a lot of good themes, good ideas, and interesting politics in there. So let's shoot the shit about it. How do you guys feel about Star Wars?
I grew up with Star Wars basically when I was young, collected the action figures, I saw the films
Did you see them in theaters?
dozens of times. I saw one of the first films I saw in the theaters, at 83, I was 6 years old. I saw Return of the Jedi in theaters before I saw the
Oh,
first
wow.
two. But I saw the first two on, I guess, VHS, so I'm kind of giving up my age there. It's something that I watched constantly, and there was only like the three movies there were the Ewok
Hell
movies,
yeah.
for TV movies with the Ewoks.
Oh,
Um,
the Christmas special?
but
Yeah,
yeah,
that's what I
yeah,
was thinking.
I grew up with that. I wasn't able to really play with G.I. Joe because my parents' religion, has an anti-war component. You know what I'm saying? If you know the history of Jehovah's Witnesses. I couldn't really play with Smurfs because they were demonic,
Oh,
right?
wow.
Like,
But
a lot
so
of,
they let you watch Star Wars then?
but not the Smurfs. Yeah, yeah.
That's interesting.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically like Star Wars was my main thing, kind of like, and
Oh,
I
wow.
identified with Luke, and I guess as I got older I kind of thought about how the Jedi were not so revolutionary, right? And so radical, kind of, even though like I learned that like the Vietnam component of what the film was about, the Empire was really the US,
Mhm.
right? And the rebels were really Vietnam, right? But then the
Going to
Jedi
the Pacific
themselves
side.
were kind of very religious and very like, I don't know what the word is.
Dogmatic. Do
Yeah,
or do
yeah.
not. There is no
And
try.
yeah, no
Yeah.
question. That comes out in the later in episode three of that came
Yeah.
out
Yeah.
in the early 2000s, when you kind of see how the Jedi are kind of lost in their own minutia, basically, in their own kind of, I don't know how to say, like, world of,
Bullshit.
yeah, yeah,
I mean,
Yeah.
that's
yeah.
that's kind of
And
the
like
thesis of the third movie.
and yeah, the third movie, right? And Luke sees it and kind of like, and it turns him to the dark side. So kind of like, and they wrestle with that.
Wrong Skywalker. Anakin sees it.
Anakin, right?
There you, yeah.
It's over. I'm
Shit. So
sorry.
we just spent, no, that's good. We spent 2 weeks, 3 weeks watching fucking Andor, everybody, and I had no idea Mike secretly loved Star Wars. So there you go. You're learning
Yeah.
this just as I do.
Yeah, no, I definitely, but this particular, like, Rogue One, right? I thought Rogue One was one of the best Star Wars movies, definitely of anything that came out after the first trilogy was
I
Rogue One.
agree.
You saw Rogue One when it came out because I skipped it until we watched Andor.
Yeah, Rogue One is definitely like, I think it may be, the people say the best one was Empire Strikes Back, but Rogue One is right up there with that. And then the Andor series, I think there's definitely not like many other Star Wars, just its story of sort of revolution and how it unfolds, and I thought it was just on a different level. Again, I've seen pretty much every single Star Wars thing there is, basically. The only thing I haven't really seen was the Acolyte. I missed some of Ashoka, but I've seen it in the cartoons. Like I saw some of the cartoons, but I've
Yeah, the cartoons, that's a big blind spot for me too. I feel like a lot of the like world building in Andor comes from the cartoons, and I guess a lot of the world building in post Disney Star Wars comes from the cartoons. And that's something I
Hmm.
also more or less missed. I watched the guy who does Samurai Jack,
Yeah,
Tartakovsky,
Tartakovsky.
Tartakovsky, yeah.
I enjoyed
That was
those, even
yeah,
though
those were cool. Then they did the Clone Wars based on his cartoons, right? Or I don't even know if they're
the
based on his
story
cartoons.
it wasn't based on it, but it would definitely helped to establish Clone Wars as something to explore. But his thing was all like mostly just style with no with no
Yeah, yeah,
substance.
yeah. Nah, the substance is the style for a Tarkovsky, man.
Yeah, yeah,
That's a different story for a different day. But anyway, what
yeah,
about
yeah.
you, Ozer? How do you feel about Star Wars at large?
One thing is I did actually watch Acolyte, and that kind of explored more of the Jedi sort of being dogmatic and caught up in their own thing and very mystic. And one thing that they explored in that show was the Jedi acting on behalf of the state, and the state was sort of a colonizer. So that was an interesting thing that they explored in that.
When does the
But
acolyte take place timeline wise?
oh shit, Acolyte. I
Because
think it takes
that's the
place like
other thing. Andor has me
a
fucked
hundred
up.
years before Andor, or something like that. 100 years
Oh
before
wow,
Andor. So it was like before Palpatine. It was like when the Sith were getting established, and it's because of the Jedi, kind of because of their.
Dialectics.
Yeah, I also like grew up on Star Wars, and I was very religious when I was younger, growing up. So I think that captured that kind of force and everything, sort of, and Luke being like almost prophet-like.
Damn, Luke the
So that
Legend.
was like the kind of, yeah, Luke the Legend, man. The Jedi were great in my opinion when I was growing up, and even as I was watching the prequels, the Jedi sort of romanticized them a bit. So like I like that aspect of Star Wars, but obviously like as I got older, I felt like the messaging wasn't necessarily that deep, I guess. I don't know. Andor turned out to be something totally different.
I always fucked with Star Wars. I liked the BioWare games. I was Knights of the Old Republic. The first one is a
Mhm.
masterpiece. The second one is also a masterpiece if you download the patch that fixes the game. That so they shipped it early, and then like a year later they figured out how to debug the game to release all the unreleased content that they had to. Anyway, so both of those games are really good. I played those a lot when I was a kid. I let's see what else. I kind of played all the games. I really like 4, 5, and 6. Didn't really like the prequels. They're kind of having their moment in the sun again. Controversially, my take is that's because everything else is so bad now that things that are bad
Mhm.
we look back on and like. But I'll also say this about the prequels. I think one thing that Andor takes really well that the prequels establish that the first films don't is the Senate and the trade conflict and obviously the like politics of that. I was gonna say it's pretty prescient on Lucas's part, but the prequels were made directly in response to George Bush and the invasion of Afghanistan and all of that, like explicitly. So it's not really prescient, it's just a really good take. How do you guys feel about the sequels? I like the first two. The first one is kind of empty calories, but I like the second one. And I'm not just saying that because of the cultural backlash and the like dividing line that it kind of caused. I like the sequel, or at least I like 1 and 2. The third sequel movie kind of sucked,
Oh
but I like
God.
this. I like the second sequel. Yeah, the third one is absolutely atrocious, but the second one is good. They fuck around a little bit. I really liked what they did with the Jedi. I like that they kind of got rid of the like dogmatism of the Jedi. That's the stuff I always liked about the Star Wars games because you could be like a gray Jedi, and I think the second sequel movie did a good job on that. And then they just fucked it up with the third sequel movie, and now nobody talks about the sequels because they just fumbled them so bad. But yeah, I feel like I'm generally neutrally pro Star Wars. I'm not like a rabid fan, but I feel like out of all the mass franchises, Star Wars has a space in my heart. I think let's jump specifically to what we're going to be talking about in the rest of this video today. Let's talk about Andor. Let's break it down season by season. There's only 2 seasons, so it's pretty easy. So, Ozair, why don't you break that down for us?
We can break it down arc by arc. So the first arc that we see is Cassian on Ferrix. I think that's where he meets Luthen. Shit goes down. Sort of establishes the conditions in which Cassian lives and chooses to join the fight. I think from there, the next arc is about Aldani. That's where they pull off that heist, which was kind of inspired by the Bolshevik bank robbery. You mentioned that in the Rolling Stone interview, which I was surprised about. And, this is the arc where Nemec writes his manifesto. And then from there, we go back. Cassian, he's still sort of apolitical, I would say. I don't know. Maybe you could disagree with that.
No, I actually
I would
totally
say
agree
that
with you.
I think he goes to like some planet where he gets wrongly imprisoned, broke some kind of local law or something, thrown into what's essentially, you know, a prison where he's now has to labor and build what we learn later are parts of a weapon. It's in this arc where you kind of see people like, you know, working together and you see actual like struggle happen. It's not just about one person doing something, and it's more about like people collectively struggling within that prison to actually escape. And so for me, that was like my favorite arc. It could be argued that the next arc is also just as good, where Cassian escapes and he has this newfound sort of consciousness, and he's on Ferrix. This is where you see more sort of collective struggle happen. People get together and struggle against what the Empire is going to try to do. Cassian is a wanted person, and what the Empire is going to try to do is capture him in Ferrix. People of Ferrix are not gonna let that happen. We get a really good speech there from
Marva.
Marva. Yeah, how did I forget that? That was her
Yeah, come
funeral
on. That's
speech.
that's the GOAT, man. Come on.
Yeah, yeah. So we get really two fantastic arcs back to back that I really absolutely love. And yeah, and then Marva's speech, which is fucking awesome, simple and spoken plainly, calling for action.
I'll tell you this. If I could do it again, I'd wake up early and be fighting these bastards from the start. Fight the Empire!
You really see change occur there, and people really rally together, and you see like literally every aspect of life just playing into it. You know, like how they're like hitting the bells and the gongs and stuff, and the empire is rattled because they don't know where they are and what they're doing. And it was so it was uplifting at the same time, kind of educating for me. I saw something that I didn't necessarily fully experience, so I got to experience it through like a medium like this. So that's what I'll say about season one. I hope, you know, that covers a little bit. That just covers like a 10% of what actually happens.
No,
Because
I
it's a
think you
lot.
hit I think you hit a lot of it.
I think one of the important points though is the first, like how the series starts. And it starts, if you remember, it starts like in a strip club where Cassian kills, I think, two cops, right?
Yeah.
And that was kind of like
Oh shit! Yes.
one thing to have a strip club in Star Wars is not, you know, is not the usual. And then to kill two cops and stuff like this. And Gilroy says that he kind of came to Disney with that and kind of said, "This is how I want to start it," or you know, are we going to be on the same page, or is it, or not? That, you know, he makes a point of kind of talking about that in a number of interviews, but that's how Andor season one is kicked off.
One thing that's really interesting to me about season one is how it starts with Cassian looking for his sister, and
Mhm.
she appears, in the background in his memories throughout the series, but he never finds her, and even at some point she almost kind of disappears from the plot. But I thought that was really interesting too, how they start with this plot that could be almost like Star Warsian, right? Find your sister. What's your
Yeah.
destiny? Go back, like, right? And then it ends in a way that we
Mm,
would really never expect.
great
Um,
point.
so
But
I
do we
thought that
find
was
out what
pretty
happens
cool.
to his sister?
I'm
Nothing. We
pretty
don't find
sure
out
we
anything.
don't.
Okay,
I think
that's
it
great.
gets, yeah, I think it's implied. And this is where I'll edit this out if I'm wrong. I'll double check. I'm pretty sure it's implied that the planet that they're on, right, collapses.
Yeah,
So I'm
yeah.
pretty sure, unless it's stated at any point in season one that he knows she ever got out. Anyway,
But you made a great point there, because that's exactly what I thought was happening when I first saw Andor was with the sister plotline. I thought that it was going in that direction. I mean, even though I've seen Rogue One.
and then we get to so after what happens, Marva's funeral, they have a Battle of Algiers inspired like rebellion scene, which kicked ass. And then, it's revealed Luthen coming to kill Cassian. But then Cassian, obviously, he says, "Fuck it, I'll join you. But instead of killing me, let me help you." And the rest is history. So season two, I'll try to be quick. One cool thing about season two, I guess thematically, but it actually sucks because you should just release your episodes episodically, like it used to be, or weekly, whatever, you know what I mean. There were four chunks of 3 episodes each released. Each 3 episode chunk spans 1 year. So it starts in 4 or 3, whatever the math is, BBY, which Ozair educated us. That's our Star Wars champion. Means before the Battle of Yavin. That's when the Death Star blew up. So it starts 3 or 4 years before the Battle of Yavin, and it's going to take us directly to when they get into the fight that blows up the Death Star. The first arc, Cassian is working in Luthen's rebel sect. You know, the quote, "We have friends everywhere," serves to be true when he's working with somebody to steal a Imperial starship. He gets the starship and he crash lands on what is ultimately revealed to be Yavin before the rebels live on Yavin, which is pretty cool. But he finds these jerk off kids, which was kind of annoying when we're watching it. But then you think about it, and it really serves a point we're going to come back to later about how do you build a rebellion and who's part of the rebellion, yada yada. But anyway, these kids kind of suck. He gets away from them, gets back to the farming colony that they were able to kind of hide away on. But now we're seeing how the Imperial overreach is affecting everybody. So the Imperials are doing the census or whatever and going into the different farms to track the people. Obviously, that's a problem. They're undocumented. So they get into a fight. They get into a shootout. They escape. One of their important guys, what's his name? Rousseau, I think he gets killed. And then we jump to the next arc. The next arc starts the Gorman subplot, which is kind of arcs 2 and 3. The first arc 2 kind of lays the groundwork for it, and in arc 3, shit really hits the fan. So arc 2, we learn about Gorman, which is pretty French. I guess it's the Euro trip of Andor. We see how the Imperials are using the media and everything to demonize the Gormans, who are portrayed as the kind of like un-American, un-Imperial, whatever weirdos, which leads to the subplot of the Gorman front. They want to fight back, but at the same time, they're being manipulated by Cyril, that bastard. They become controlled opposition, and Cassian doesn't kind of fuck with them, and he goes and leaves. Oh, I guess I should say the point of Gorman is that there's an important fuel in the planet, kind of reminiscent of what we see on Cassian's planet, that they're mining the planet so intensely that they're literally, terraforming the planet. So we know there's a fuel that they have to harness, spoilers for the Death Star, that's going to destroy the planet when they start harvesting it. So flash forward to Arc 3, they're getting ready to harvest it. Now they really need to upgrade their shit. And we see the propaganda, we see the Imperial overreach, and we see everything kick into absolute overdrive. False flag event. They basically send the Imperial troops to start a riot. They use that as a reason to just massacre everybody. They say that the Gormans started it, which leads to Mon Mothma, the politician in Senate. This is the end of the arc. She risks her life at the end to go and give the big speech about how it was actually a massacre and a genocide and that it wasn't what the media is saying. That takes us to the very end of Andor, where Luthen, shit has finally caught up to Luthen. So Luthen learns from Lonnie Young, rest in peace, GOAT, that the Death Star is being created. He learns that the Imperials are really onto him and he's about to die, or get caught rather, well, both. So while that's going on, we see Cassian grappling with this, with the new rebels. We now have this almost militant rebel alliance that's run like a militant and political organization that's very different than Luthen's offshoot in good and bad ways, right? That's something we can talk about later, but that interplay of respecting what happened before versus responding to what they think they need to do in the present. Anyway, they bring Clea back to Yavin, and they get confirmation that the Death Star is being built, and that takes us to Rogue One, right? And then Rogue One, they get the Death Star plans. Death Star plans delivered, and that takes us to the actual Star Wars, right?
Yep.
Right?
You took
Did I
it
miss
right there.
anything? So yeah, I think there's obviously a lot to dive into here. I feel like one of my hesitations when we were talking about watching and analyzing this is because the critical acclaim was pretty universal, right? I feel like everybody agreed that this was the shit. Do you think that's a fair take?
I agree. Yeah, I think it received a lot of positive reviews. And
I don't know if Mega was that happy. I mean, because there were these kind of things, Star Wars is now woke, right? And kind of, which was like a derogatory thing coming from Mega, basically.
I would say that really started all the way back in 2016 with the
Ah,
sequels. So
okay.
I'm glad we actually brought that up because you're right too, Mike, that Star Wars, especially over the last decade, has been a flashpoint in the culture war. So I like what you say there, Mike, about MAGA. Because one of the quotes I have from Marva, actually, rest in peace to the GOAT, is in her speech, she says,
Fire is a disease that thrives in darkness. It is never more alive than when we sleep.
I feel like, yeah, we got to stay woke. I feel like there's been such a cultural backlash to like woke politics. Marva's speech there kind of encapsulates something I feel, which is like, fuck that. Like it's good to be woke. Don't let the right wing make it a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you have really is like just a story. I mean, the way I read it, the way I interpreted it was just like it's an interpretation of what it means to lead a revolutionary life, right? And kind of all the sacrifices that involves, the willingness to, to die for your comrades or to fight for your comrades, the willingness to die for a cause that's larger than yourself. One of the things that stood out to me, I was watching some of the Gilroy, is that he basically says with it, when he was talking about which was one of my favorite, which is probably my favorite episode, which is the episode, I believe, 10, which is the backstory of Luthen and Leia. And he basically says, we knew we were going to do this. And one of the things that we wanted to do from the start was it wasn't going to be about revenge. Like Luthen's story wasn't going to be about revenge. And I
Mm.
think like kudos to Gilroy for thinking about that and thinking that basically because the rebellion is built on hope. It's not built on revenge. It's not built, any revolution worth its salt is not built on revenge. It's built on, revolutionary love and, and hope for the future, to the generations that come after you. And it's actually fighting for a cause that's bigger than oneself. It's not all rosy. We talk about Huey P. Newton's concept of revolutionary suicide and sort of how once you become a revolutionary, you're kind of walking around with a death sentence that may or may not be carried out at any given time, right? So Luthen's whole thing about kind of like when you and I first got together, we signed the death sentence. We signed that we were going to get hung, and that's how this was going to end. We weren't going to see the rebellion and all this kind of stuff. Like, and then there's the kind of what did it turn into? What did it turn us into? Like, I mean, getting into Mon Mothma, will she ever see her family again? Right. And she has to leave, her husband and her, any interaction that she may have with her daughter, with her family, basically. Like these are the sacrifices. Claya has to kill the person that kind of raised her and mentored her, basically, in Luthen. It's all about sacrifice and kind of devotion to a cause bigger than oneself. So kind of like I think that Gilroy does an excellent job of his interpretation of what it means. I mean, there's that scene. I mean, the scene in again episode 10 where Luthen tells Claya, a young Claya, to look around the room before he's about to detonate a bomb, and he says, this is what you're giving up, right? The fancy restaurant, the good food, right? This is he basically says, this is what you're giving up. I want you to be aware of this. Basically, she's like, you're just scared. She doesn't realize it at the time, but there's a constant reference that and it's really embedded in and imbued in the dialogue between Luthen and Cassian, basically about what is it turning us into. We're not the people that are living our best life because of the sacrifices that we have to make. So it's not all rosy, basically, but it is sacrifice to kind of a higher cause, that actually you're making these sacrifices on behalf of the galaxy, right? And on behalf of the future, on behalf of something that you'll never see, you decided to devote your life to that. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's why Cassian's character often frustrated me, because he was determined to kind of like have to do things his way.
certainly would be interesting if you didn't. But now you both disappointed me.
And that's what's most important, right? How it goes for you.
What's most important is the cause.
And both times I saw the season 2 twice, and both times when Bix records that message that she's leaving him, temporarily to because she doesn't want him to lead the rebellion, and she's choosing the rebellion for him. Like I'm like, hell yeah, Bix, that's a revolutionary, right? It's a hard decision to make for oneself, but kind of like it's not about oneself, right? It's about getting to the world that we want to see and devotion to that. And that devotion kind of means that you're not going to live the life that you can otherwise live.
Yeah, and I think we see that a lot. We see that a lot in season 2. Andor's like bristling individuality in a positive light and in a negative light. I agreed with you that Bix makes a responsible decision. Obviously, she knows she's pregnant. Cassian knows she's pregnant. He's immediately going to want to leave and stop what he's doing, which I think that's natural. I think even as people who strive for fighting, right? This is something, or at least it's something I've talked about. Like when you have those commitments, it does problematize putting others before you in a way, the cause before yours, and like what you feel you have a responsibility to. But I think season 2 does a good job too of at the end, when the quote unquote rebel leaders are basically pissing on Luthen's grave. And at this point, that's the rebellion. And Cassian should, in a way, quote unquote, listen to them and respect them. And like in the revolutionary moment, when the one commander is like, soon the day's coming that you're gonna have to log when you fly out and when you fly back in, and Cassian's like, that's gonna be my last day here. That energy is kind of channeled at the end for him to be like, no, Luthen was right. You guys are here trying now to take credit for everything he did, but he's the one who really should deserve and I don't think it's about deserving the recognition, more so he doesn't want them to get in the way of what he feels like Luthen was doing. What you're talking about, Mike, that the bristling of his individuality, I think they do kind of push that at the end to show Cassian's growth and to show that he also, even though this is his character, at the end he realizes that Luthen was right. And then, like, look at what he does. I guess at the beginning of Rogue One, the first thing he does is something Luthen would very much do, and shoot the informant as soon as he feels like a detriment to their like escape or whatever it is. So I think we definitely see Cassian come to understand that, adapt that, but in a way that it's realistic. Because look, I think it's only natural to like how do you guys feel about that? I thought that was a very interesting dynamic, the tension with the rebel, like once the rebels become an institution, Cassian obviously is so important to them and he's working with them, but there's that tension too. That's the same tension you're talking about, I think.
I think my feeling about that is kind of like if you look at Saul Guerrero, if you look at Luthen, if you look at Yavin, the Yavin Moon, yes, it's definitely true that without Saul and without Luthen, the Yavin project doesn't begin. But I also think that kind of like the Yavin project is a step. I mean, one of the things at their best when the Nepalese Maoists used to talk about a new mainstream, right? Is that kind of like we do need a new mainstream. I think obviously what Luthen starts and what Saul Guerrero is a part of is extremely important in kickstarting the rebellion. But actually, the rebellion does need to evolve, right? And it does need to become mainstream, and it needs to take power, right? So kind of like, I think there's kind of like maybe a pessimism in that part. But one of the things I'm thinking about is like Gilroy talks about wanting to show the diversity and all the different characters, all the different categories of character in a revolutionary situation. How it's kind of like you're not going to get a chance to like make a series about a revolutionary situation, and he wants to show all the diversity of character within that. So kind of I think that he does a good job of that, where Cassian's certain struggles with individualism to kind of like to Luthen's kind of like clarity of morality, but not so much purity of morality is another article that talks about like how Luthen and shows kind of a clarity, like a moral clarity, but not a moral purity, basically.
Sure.
And then kind of like how the people who are being led by Luthen are, critical of him for kind of his ruthlessness to a certain extent. So there's all the different characters, and I think those are all important. I think you need that loving, idealistic, and I think you need Luthen's ruthlessness as well. I think you need all those things gelling together, basically. I do think that revolutions have to evolve and become mainstream because the purpose of revolution is to take power and transform the world. So things couldn't have stayed at the level where Luthen was kind of underground and doing things in cells and stuff like that, and it needed to get to the point where there was an army and there was an organized rebellion. So that's my thinking
Yeah.
on that, I think.
Yeah, I actually really agree with your point that the growth of the rebellion had to be shown. And in that case, one thing I thought that they ultimately did really well, and you kind of touched on this, as it's shown, we see the reality of it, that it's not always smooth. We see Saw's group. Saw is one of my favorite characters, and that guy kicks ass. Forrest Whitaker, obviously, GOAT, but he's a maniac. The official Rebel Alliance, for all their professionalism and integrity and whatever, they're fucked up too. Gilroy says, and that's why I call them the OGs. He says, what happens to the original gangsters? What happens to the people who were there at the beginning? Because Yavin is a very establishment place, and there's not a lot of room for the original maniacs that started everything. And he says it fits thematically with a lot of blah, 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 blah. But I agree. I think that was one of the most interesting things in the show. Because at the end of the day, the Luthen is right and Saw is right. But the Rebel Alliance is also right. So everybody has a point here and everybody serves an important purpose, and they all come together, and there's unity and there's struggle, and then there's unity, and then sometimes they break apart and sometimes they come back together. And I think that was a very realistic way of showing organization building. Now, when I went into this, I tried to go into it with a pessimistic perspective. I almost wanted to play devil's advocate. I was a little hesitant. I was a little skeptical because I think here's an important question. Can capitalist media produce legitimately revolutionary and radical art? And I went into Andor with the perspective of no. However, as I watched, obviously, I had a little thesis, a little antithesis, and a little synthesis. So my thesis was there's no chance, except that the most revolutionary media and the most revolutionary content, even though I hate to use that word, can be produced by these multi-billion-dollar, slop shops. It's gonna make us. I conceptualize it as almost the fandomization. Am I saying that right? The fandom, yeah, the fandomization, fandomization, whatever,
Yep.
of like revolution. On one hand, it's good to inspire people, like even when we go to protests and we see people holding signs like we have friends everywhere and stuff like that. And on one hand, yes, that's good. On the other hand, though, I think we have to be careful. I think we all know capitalism is really adept at defanging revolutions and revolutionary ideas and revolutionary figures. And I'm thinking, we talked about this at the beginning, Star Wars was originally about Vietnam and the Viet Cong repelling the American invasion. So why the fuck did we lose sight of that over 40 years and let Star Wars become this, like, where right-wingers felt like it was their media, which is why they threw such a hissy fit in 2016. The original movie was, in a way, revolutionary, and we forgot because it matriculates through this billion-dollar, I mean, back then it was LucasArts, I guess, or whatever, and now it's Disney. And I think there's a message there of, if we're not critical of that, if we don't pay attention to the fandoming or the defanging of the ideas, through the media cycle, it can bite us in the ass. However, like all good thinkers, I also thought of the flip side. I will say that everything I said, I think, is a legitimate point. Even if that's the case, Andor is obviously radical. It's clearly political. Gilroy himself is not shy about the fact that he's making it political, even though obviously he's smart. There was that interview after the show came out, and he was like, "No, this isn't a left wing show. My heavens, of course not. I would never think about it that way." Meanwhile, he's in other interviews talking about Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky and the Battle of Algiers and all of this. And then we watched an interview where the interviewer was basically like, "No, Tony, we know that you don't take from news to influence your writing." And in that interview, he was like, "Well, today I don't," implying that on the Disney dole, and as the representative of Disney, he couldn't say that. But this is a guy who obviously really has a reason for putting this stuff on screen. So here was my synthesis. So even though we do have to be careful, we're damned to use the tools of our oppressor to fight back. So just like at the end of season 2, when they commandeer the K2 droid from the Gorman genocide, and obviously they recalibrate it into their fucking killing machine that saves their ass at the end of the series. And I'm thinking now, here's another good quote that fits in with that. When Clea is like,
"Just promise me if it doesn't look perfect, you won't engage."
I think we used up all the perfect.
and I think that's real. We can't be overly picky. We gotta, take what we can get. And so I think we have to be conscious of that. I think that was my that was my trial and tribulation as I was going through Andor. That was my character arc. So every 3 episodes, I would hear the Ferrex gong. That it'd be like, is it revolutionary? Maybe not. But by the end, I will say I do think you can, and I think Andor is. I think it's very radical. But fuck Disney, right? Like we always have to say that.
Oh yeah, of course. That goes without saying. I think one thing I want to add though is that I remember Republicans throwing a bit of a hissy fit about Revenge of the Sith. There's a line in there that Anakin says to Obi-Wan before they have their epic duel, which is that either you're with me or against me. Obi-Wan's like only a Sith deals in absolutes or something like that. And then a lot of people thought that was a criticism of George Bush.
It probably was.
Yeah, so I think making political statements seems to be a thing, I guess, with Star Wars. No matter how maybe milquetoast it is, it's still somewhat associated with having something to say politically. I think, there's contradictions that exist in capitalism, right? In that we don't need to treat it like it's a monolith, and that things can be produced that have like a revolutionary content, but ultimately it sort of depends on what we do with it, right? Because capitalism is going to try to commodify revolutionary things. Ultimately it really depends on whether we take that and subvert it into actual like revolutionary activity. But yeah, I think that's an interesting question and something that I always ask myself. One thing is to look at what the fandom itself thinks of the show, and what are the audiences saying. And if you go on like the Andor subreddit, you'll see a lot of political content in like this subreddit about a TV show, and there's people making connections to just what's happening now in real life. I'm actually trying to look through it. Something like Nemec's manifesto, I feel like I've seen it be like quoted a lot. The frontier of the rebellion is like everywhere, and even the smallest act of insurrection like pushes our lines forward. I thought that was that's pretty powerful stuff, and I think that it's up to us to use that. What do you think about this, Mike?
I think Marx is still correct, right? When he says that the ruling ideas of any epic are the ideas of the ruling class. That is true. If you look at Hollywood, if you look at bourgeois production companies, that actually, yes, the ruling ideas of any epic are the ideas, of the rulers, basically. And that essentially, in the main, you're going to get propaganda, you're going to get kind of things that upholds the validity of the empire. And I'm talking about the United States empire, right? Not the Star Wars empire. But I also think that socialism and communism, the conditions for socialism and communism come out of capitalism, right? Come out of kind of the conditions that we currently have. The roots for socialism and communism exist within this society, and you're going to see from the first discussion that we had, the class struggle permeates all realms basically, and I think it's particularly strong in culture. There will be flashpoints and utterings and points of emphasis, that kind of break with the bourgeois narrative, and that actually put forward a revolutionary and a communist narrative, right? Or a progressive and radical narrative, right? So I think it's kind of bullshit to think that everything that comes out of Hollywood is propaganda. Everything that comes out of Hollywood is bad and bourgeois. That's a particular line, and I think it's wrong. I think yes, the ruling ideas will be promoted within Hollywood and within mainstream television and mainstream media, but that actually, like, kind of to Ozer's point, there's contradiction, and that actually the roots of the future society lie within things that exist in this society. We'll see shoots and starts of revolutionary desires, revolutionary thinking within art. And I don't necessarily think that I think, yeah, that people are gonna do with that what they can to co-opt it and to so I don't think it's necessarily the fault of Star Wars or Andor that, like, years after Star Wars, for instance, you said 40 years later, we still are where we are. That's what the bourgeoisie is going to do. I think Mao says, wherever there's oppression, there's resistance. That as long as we live in an oppressive society, we're going to see those shoots and shots come out in different sectors of society, and definitely within art. And we should embrace them and push them forward.
Yeah.
I think intention matters. I think what people are trying to do with their art matters. You know what I'm saying? And the consequences, like, people say the consequences matter more than the intention, but I feel like the consequences, are your interpretation sometimes, and they're not as clear cut, and the intentions actually are important. And what is somebody trying to do with their art? To say something about what it would mean to have a better world, to say something about colonization and imperialism and so forth. I don't always agree with some of the criticisms in that sense. I do think that we should treat artists, people like Gilroy, people like, I'm thinking of the Susan Sarandons and the Tim Robbins and the
Sutherland.
Danny Glover and Harry
Well,
Belafonte, right?
the
They're
actress
kind
who
of
plays
like,
Deidre is the actress who
Yeah,
plays
Denise Go.
Deidre is, yeah, she's incredibly outspoken for Palestine.
yeah, I mean, when people try to do good things, we should acknowledge that, right? And we shouldn't just be critical because they make a lot of money, or because they're working in Hollywood, but actually we should judge the content. And when people want to, people, when those shoots of resistance emerge, we should actually, like, encourage them. Both the people who are trying to do the right thing, and also encourage those messages in society.
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of the message, there's one last thing I wanted to talk about before we started to wrap up. So the timeline of Star Wars is really weird. And I think it's because I guess George Lucas, or maybe, I don't know if it's because of the extended universe, I don't know why, but there's no way that they meant for there to only be 20 years between the prequels and the original movies, right? So I feel like there's actually something to be taken from there, because the story of the story of the prequels and the story of Andor is how a feckless, like, senatorial liberal democracy, or if not fail, at least open the door to fascism. And then we see the resistance. We see how difficult it was to build a resistance. We see all the sacrifices all saw to Luthen, to Mon Mothma, to obviously Cassian and Bix themselves had to make. And then within fucking 30 years after that, the fascists are back and they took over the government again in the sequels. I think maybe if I wanted to be annoying, I would say what we need to learn from there where it's maybe something Andor even is lacking a little bit is the aspects of revolution it shows are so important, but we don't really have a vision for what the post-imperial society looks like. Do you guys agree? Maybe in Andor, the most we get is Nemik's manifesto, which talks about the brittle nature of oppression, how the harder they're oppressing us shows how how truly weak they are. The Imperials are the paper tigers, and it's all a show of force to make us think that they can stop us, but they can't. But we don't really have a vision of what a post-imperial world looks like. And I think, shit, maybe that's why in the Star Wars universe, every 25 years, there's a fucking fascist coup. What would communism look like in the Star Wars galaxy? But I'm serious. What's going on here that you have so many revolutions, and every time you have a revolution in this universe, the fascists are there to, take it back?
Star Wars is not really science fiction. It's more fantasy than science fiction. But if you look at science fiction in general, if you look at just pictures of the future in general nowadays, they're all dystopian. You know what I'm saying? There are not that many rosy pictures of what the future is going to look like. And kind of like
Sure.
if you want to go back and look at like a communist or a future that got it right, basically. I mean, Star Trek: The Next Generation, right? Those are kind of series that kind of depict humanity that got it right, that had communistic type societies, where kind of like humanity had kind of got its shit together, was out in the space exploring new worlds and commiserating with other alien life forms and kind of like so. But you don't have that anymore. I mean, that there needs to be more of that. Like, what would the good future look like? Because, and I mean, it's in line with kind of what with the crisis that we find ourselves in. That everything looks bleak, right? That the people are not depicting positive stories about what the future holds because it doesn't look so good right now. So creating that kind of hope and creating that kind of thing is important.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So with that, my friends, I think that takes us to the end of our second episode of the Partisans Cultural Committee. Please don't forget to like and subscribe as always. Share with your friends. Shoot us a comment. Let us know if you love Andor, hate Andor, you love the sequels, the prequels. Let's talk about it. All right, my friends, thanks for listening.